As the temps start rising, I feel the familiar urge to refresh my closet, but I don't want to waste money on pieces I'll only wear once or for just one season. Thankfully, Quince changes that. Their clothes are timeless, lightweight, and far more elevated than anything else at this price. It finally feels like my wardrobe matches my standards. The best part is that Quince only works with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing practices and premium fabrics and finishes, so you get to look good while feeling good. I'm pretty excited that I have upgraded my athleisure wardrobe for this summer. I bought a sweatshirt and a pair of wide-leg flow pants that are two of the softest items I own, and I plan to live in them. So join me in giving your summer closet an upgrade with Quince. Go to quince.com/POTC for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. That's QUINCE.com/POTC to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/POTC.
The first step to learning anything well is to figure out, well, what is the skill? How do people learn it? What is the material? And so obviously good teachers can help with this process. It's always great if you can have someone who can break it down to you. But if you don't have access to that, then that's sort of your first starting point. What is the skill? What am I trying to learn? How does it break down? What is the knowledge? What are the concepts that I have to understand? And if you can form that kind of map, you have a much better idea of, okay, how do I sort of efficiently acquire these methods? How do I efficiently learn the procedures that I need to do to succeed in this domain?
That was Scott Young on Psychologist Off the Clock.
We are four experts in psychology here to bring you cutting-edge and science-based ideas to help you flourish in your relationships, work, and health.
I'm Dr. Debbie Sorensen, a clinical psychologist practicing in Mile High, Denver, Colorado, and author of Act for Burnout, Act Daily Journal, and the Act Daily Card Deck.
From America's Heartland, I'm Dr. Emily Edlin, a clinical psychologist based in Chicago, Illinois, and author of Autonomy Supportive Parenting.
Calling in from Vienna, Austria, I'm Michael Herold, ACT coach, confidence trainer, and author of an upcoming book on being a better conversationalist and making friends.
And from coastal New England, I'm Dr. Jill Stoddard, author of Be Mighty, The Big Book of ACT Metaphors, and Imposter No More.
We hope you take what you learn here to build a rich and meaningful life.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock. Hello, everyone. Michael here, and I am sitting here with Debbie to talk about my interview with Scott Young on his book, Be Better at Anything. So, Debbie, you just listened to my interview with Scott. What were your thoughts on it?
Well, I found it really inspiring because this is a conversation about learning new things, new information, new skill sets. And I'm kind of a lifelong learner at heart. Like, I just love taking classes. And I think my dream of retirement is to just dabble around taking classes in various things that I just am curious about and want to learn about, from skills to just new subjects of knowledge that I'm unfamiliar with. Just as an example, I'm reading the book A Gentleman in Moscow, which has been a pretty popular book about, I don't know, it's maybe 5 or 10 years old. And there's all these references to Russian literature that I've never read. And I thought, I really want to read Anna Karenina and War and Peace, and maybe I could take a class on that and sign up for one of those adult education courses. And then I realized, okay, I really don't have time for that right now. But maybe when I retire, I can do that. And anyways, I think that Scott's done all this research on how we learn. And I think it's interesting to learn more about that and some of the myths that are out there about how we learn. I mean, I think some of the things that you might have heard about, 10,000 hours and you can't teach an old dog new tricks and these kinds of things.
So this is funny because I talk about ChatGPT or large language models with Scott as well. And because you mentioned the big Russian literary works, tried to make my way through some of them. But frankly, I couldn't be bothered. Nothing, against these literary giants, but I just couldn't make my way through. And then I had ChatGPT just explain them to me. I was like, hey, dude, I read this book. It was Guilt and Punishment. I'm translating the
Crime and Punishment.
Crime and Punishment.
Yes.
Smartass. And hey, like, I listened this halfway through. Tell me why this is considered such a great work. How does it compare to other works and other artists? And how was this received at the time? It was like a really interesting conversation that I had with ChatGPT around this book while I was like going around my house, like cleaning stuff up.
Well, and that's interesting you say that, because you want to learn about things that you have some sort of intrinsic interest in. And I'm interested in that, or learning how to make a quilt.
Yes. See, this is like, I think the new thing that got introduced to me at this point was 5 years ago, I would have had two choices. Read the freaking book and see what it's all about, AKA like spend 100 hours. I'm a slow reader, like going through this giant of a tome of a book. Or spend several hours on the internet reading analysis of the book and interpretations and historical around surroundings and so on. And just the immediate access that I had to all of the information, because I didn't want to read the book to have read the book. I wanted to read the book because it was like everyone talks about it. I do go into some depth on the topic with Scott. I just wanted to highlight that since we were talking about Russian literature, like this is how I read it. But apart from that, I'm curious, what are you learning?
So right now I have Duolingo, and I'm learning a little bit of Italian, which I had studied way back in the day. So it's a little bit of a refresher course, but I'm so rusty that I'm trying to refresh that. And I'm actually reading a few books on writing, just kind of trying to learn some writing skills, which is something, we all do all the time. And I've written books and that kind of thing. But I feel like that's one of those things you actually talk about writing with Scott in the interview. It's one of those things you can always kind of improve your skills on. And so I'm reading a few writing books. How about you, Michael? What are you learning these days?
So I feel like my learning endeavors are split into two parts. One is like the necessities. So I've told you all in the podcast like way too many times of this new hobby that I picked up of going to the like racetrack with a remote control buggy, 1/10 scale.
Mm-hmm.
And right now I'm building my own, and there's so many. And this is like an endeavor of like, I don't know, 3 days or so. It's not like I'm going to spend a year doing that, but it's like a couple of days of putting that kit together. And there's so many different settings for the camber, toe in, like different tire settings, different engine settings. And I'm just reading up on all of that, which is necessary in order to get the result. What I'm learning for fun is very often ancient history. I love getting involved in the Greek stuff, the Roman stuff, Old Testament, early Christianity, early religion in general. Like these are just things that interest me to no end, and I can spend hours. And I'll probably go through 3, 4, 5 books a year on historical topics. And that is really just with no outcome attached. I'm just interested in it.
Okay. Yeah. And to me, that's where it becomes more, when there's no outcome attached and you're just interested in it, where it becomes this really life enriching thing, where it's like, oh, I'm just curious about this and I want to maybe have this new skill or this new body of information. And that's exactly what I'm talking about, that the lifelong learner in me wants to keep doing into retirement. It's not for a job. It's completely impractical sometimes. And yet, it's fun. And there is that curiosity about learning new things. And of course, sometimes you have to learn those skills, life skills, which can be important too.
Okay, everyone, then I hope you all enjoy my interview with Scott Young. And to you, Debbie, I say grazie, ciao.
Ciao, Michael.
Scott H. Young is the Wall Street Journal bestselling author of Ultra Learning, a podcast host, a computer programmer, and an avid reader. Since 2006, he has published weekly essays to help people learn and think better. His work has been featured in the New York Times, Pocket, and Business Insider, on the BBC, at TEDx, and other outlets. Today, we're talking about his latest book, Get Better at Anything, 12 Maxims for Mastery.
Hello, Scott. Welcome to the show.
Oh, it's great to be here.
So I heard about you almost 10 years ago from a colleague.
Wow.
And I'm paraphrasing what he said. There was something along the lines of, dude, there's this one guy who went through the MIT 4-year computer science course and he did it in 1. So this is probably summarizing it. Not perfectly, and I'm getting a few details wrong, but what was the adventure you put yourself through?
Yeah. So, well, as you're saying, this is like over 10 years ago now. I did this project. Now, so I'll give some background. So I went to school, I studied business. It was one of those cases where like there was a fork in the road. I could have gone down to study business. I could have studied computer science. I chose business. I finished business school and I was like, I kind of feel like I should go back to school and study computer science. But I mean, I'd already gotten a degree. I didn't really want to go back to school and do that. And MIT very graciously uploads a lot of their material online for free. So if you go on to OpenCourseware, so ocw.mit.edu, there's just like thousands of courses where they've just, uploaded the lectures and they've uploaded the problem sets, and then there's solutions for the problem sets. And so I did one or two of these, and it was just sort of like, well, could you do something that tries to emulate what an MIT student would do for their degree, right? So I went there and I looked up what an MIT student, which classes they take. And of course, like you can't take the one where you need to have access to the robot or the one where you have to give a speech in class. But I mean, with a few substitutions, you can get it pretty close. And so that's what it was. I bought the books. I started going through the classes. And so the goal was to try to get through all the final exams and do the programming project. So a little bit more of a bare bones of the actual MIT experience, admittedly. But yeah, and I wanted to do it over a year. That was a little bit my kind of early 20-something cockiness, but I did work hard and I did get through it. And then, yeah, that was later became my kind of like claim to fame where, that's still people are introducing me with that project. So I'm glad it continues to encourage and inspire people.
Yeah, I was expecting that this might not be the first time you're retelling that story when I asked you the question.
But it's a good one.
You're like a Canadian Hermione Granger on turbo boost mode.
I like that. Yeah.
So let's do a time jump here. 10 years later, you wrote your new book, Get Better at Anything. Mm-hmm. And in that book, you cover 12 maxims. If you were to summarize the main themes, what are they?
Yeah, so the central idea of the book is that I divide sort of the ingredients that we need to get better at anything into seeing, doing, and feedback. So seeing is the idea that most of what we know comes from other people. So the ease of learning things from other people, from sort of building on accumulated wisdom, what's already out there, is one of the major bottlenecks, not just for our individual progress, but for the progress of entire fields. And so there's lots of really interesting examples of from science, technology to even the opening story I talk about Tetris, where if you change the environment, radical progress can occur because it's easier to learn from other people. It's better to collaborate. The second idea is doing, which is that obviously to get good at things, we require practice. I don't think that's a surprise to anyone, but it was very interesting diving deep into the research that like the kind of practice really matters, that there's a lot of these little knobs or levers on how we practice, how we do the work that we're doing that influences how good we can get. And finally, feedback. This was another area that I was also surprised at, that turns out that there's like lots of areas of skill where people have decades of experience and they're not really objectively that good at what they're doing. And this is sort of a dispiriting finding, but it just shows how important getting feedback from the environment is. And so I have a whole section where I cover some of the research from, the importance of feedback from the actual environment you're practicing in, to corrective feedback, to even just how it influences our emotions, which we can maybe get into as well. It seems to be a very important component in how we overcome anxieties and fears as well.
I think it was actually the last chapter on how it is so important to do exposure
therapy. Yeah,
when it comes to that, it was brilliant. I was telling my colleagues that this was the chapter that explained exposure therapy in the most concise way I've ever read about it, including that you need to keep doing this, because if you drop the ball, this is the fear is going to come back. But hopefully, in hour number 3 of our conversation, we'll have time to get there as well. Here's another broad question for you. What would you say are the biggest misunderstandings in our culture when it comes to learning?
Well, I mean, I think there's lots to mention. I can go down so many rabbit holes right now. So, I mean, the sort of go-to one, which is the thing people believe about learning. If you're not really in this subject, that you've spent a lot of time learning about educational psychology or studying strategy or this kind of thing, and you've just kind of vaguely heard from the sort of currents of self-help wisdom, the most common one that people talk about is learning styles. So this is this idea that like there's visual, kinesthetic, auditory, or like, holistic or tactical or whatever kind of learning style is. And I know I've got an audience of psychologists, so you already know this, but they're not real. This is not true. And there's good research showing they're not true. So that's one of them. But I think there's some others that float around that if they're not like learning styles where they're just like, that idea doesn't work at all. They're just sort of a little off. So one of them I disagree with is this 10,000 hour rule. This was really popularized by Malcolm Gladwell. And I think it's not so much the sort of the brute idea that to reach world-class status, you need to practice about 10,000 hours. There's some quibbles about that. Sometimes it's less, sometimes it's more, this kind of thing. But I mean, there is some kernel of truth to that. John Hayes, his original work looking at like how long it took people in various creative fields to reach eminence, so like painters, poets, this kind of stuff, and finding that it's about 10 years sort of, and if you work backwards, how many hours would 10 years be? It's not totally off base, these numbers, so they do have some kind of like grounding in truth. But the main interpretation I take from talking to people about this 10,000 hour rules is that, well, the key to getting good is just doing something for 10,000 hours. And the funny thing is that the research that sort of whole idea is based on, Carl Anders Ericsson's work on deliberate practice, was essentially the opposite. That just doing something a lot does not make you particularly good at it. And that was what motivated this whole concept of this specific kind of practice, which is focused practice under the guidance of a coach with immediate feedback. And that like it was doing this that allowed certain violinists to become really, really good, whereas a lot of violinists just didn't get that good. But I feel like, this 10,000 hour rule, that just do something for 10,000 hours, you'll be world class, is probably one of the more misleading ones about learning. I mean, I could keep going, but we have time. So
it's funny. I actually had the 10,000 hour rule question in my list of things that I wanted to ask you as well.
All right. Well, we've checked that one off.
We've checked that one off. Great.
Yeah.
Hey, Michael here. As you might have already heard, I'm currently working on a book on confidence building, having better conversations, and making friends. Would you like to work with me to make this happen? I don't know about you, but I like self-development books that aren't just about the theory and the exercises. I like books that are full of real stories and insights from people who have worked through the concepts and have gotten the results they wanted. And that's how I envision my book too. So I'm looking for a handful of coaching clients to work with me over the next couple of weeks. If you struggle with confidence or your social skills, we can work together for 8 weeks in one-on-one coaching sessions that are tailored towards your specific goals. And your story will, anonymously, of course, be featured in my book and help and inspire others. I'm only going to work on this with 10 people, and as a thank you, offer 50% off my coaching package. If you think this is for you, then head over to herald.coach/book and apply. That's all. Back to the show.
So let me throw a couple of broad learning questions your way in an attempt to turn this into a totally free coaching session for myself. And then we'll see which one of the maxims come up for us to discuss. Let's say I'm learning a completely new skill from the ground up. Where do I start?
Well, I don't know. This is an idea that I think is very potent, because if you're taking on your own project to learn a skill, one of the major difficulties is that there's this kind of like knowledge paradox that you don't know the thing that you would know if you already knew the skill, right? And so in this sort of situation where if you have like no access to resources, you're like completely on your own, the only thing you can do is problem solving. All you can try to do is, try to work through it. And I don't want to say problem solving is just trial and error. It's clearly not. We have a little bit more intelligence than that. But we are forced to rely on what the cognitive scientist Herbert Simon called weak methods. These are these sort of heuristic tools for solving problems where we don't have any, particular knowledge that would guide us in this. We don't have methods. We don't have strategies. We don't have ideas. And the problem is that there's some good reasoning to think that while this can have some salubrious effects to help with learning, as a general, if you only rely on problem solving, it's going to be pretty inefficient, because it's going to take you a long time to find the right methods. You may never find the right methods. And even if you do encounter them, you are going to be very taxed cognitively speaking. You're going to have a lot of your working memory bandwidth taken up with trying to do this problem solving effort. You may not even appreciate the sort of the true methods that you actually stumble upon by accident. And so I talk about in the book this idea that the first step to learning anything well is to figure out, well, what is the skill? How do people learn it? What is the material? And so obviously good teachers can help with this process. It's always great if you can have someone who can break it down to you. But if you don't have access to that, then that's sort of your first starting point. What is the skill? What am I trying to learn? How does it break down? What is the knowledge? What are the concepts that I have to understand? And if you can form that kind of map, you have a much better idea of, okay, how do I sort of efficiently acquire these methods? How do I efficiently learn the procedures that I need to do to succeed in this domain?
So we have a chicken and an egg problem, basically, where I'm running into problems that I don't understand yet because I haven't learned any skills. And at the same time, if I only learn the skills, I don't know what problems I'm going to run into.
Right. Well, let's jump into that a little bit. Your chicken and egg problem. Like, if you look at it in this sort of like naive way, well, that's just impossible. Like, how can you teach yourself something that you don't know? But luckily, skills and subjects are organized. Like, if you want to learn piano, you go to the bookstore and there's books about piano learning. There's websites that show people demonstrating piano. If you want to learn a language, you can come up with vocabulary lists. You can come up with these things. So it is possible, like, before you take a class, to look at the syllabus and look what they're going to teach. So it's not quite such a paradoxical kind of move, but it is this sort of idea that if you're going to embark upon learning something, the sort of first step is to figure out, well, what is it that you're trying to learn? What resources are out there? How can you do this? So I call this meta learning, this sort of preliminary step of like figuring out what it is that you're actually trying to accomplish.
So I'm thinking of all the sources that we now have access to in this fantastic world that we're living in, where if, for example, I wanted to learn conversation skills, I could go on Instagram and binge like video after video on that in order to learn the skills. How do I make sure that the sources that I've chosen are going to be promising sources for improvement?
Yeah. I mean, it is hard. I think like one of the major sort of findings, I think, from educational psychology over the last 50 years has been the importance of background knowledge to future learning. That, like, you know, everyone knows the Dunning-Kruger effect. That one gets cited a lot. But David Dunning's work, I think, really showed that it's not just sort of, you know, arrogance, that these things occur because of this fundamental deficiency in assessing your own abilities when you lack knowledge, right? If you don't know what the right answer is or the right way to solve an answer for a problem, then how do you know whether you're doing well or not? Like, it kind of creates this sort of problem. And so I do think if you're completely new to a domain, you are going to pick badly sometimes. I think there's some heuristics you can rely on. Like, if I'm going to learn a domain that has any overlap with an academic field, I'm going to start with a textbook, right? I'm not going to go to the shelf of the, you know, popular section, which is written, you know, in sort of bombastic style, which, like, I'm going to pick up some textbook. And I mean, I know that I'm like writing books that go in that section of the store and that probably for the person who wants to like understand how learning and memory works, they can get the book called Learning and Memory by John Anderson, who's one of the leading researchers. I know most people aren't going to do that. So I do try to make the popular books a little bit more accurate, but I do think that that's probably one of the strategies. Okay, are there courses? Are there textbooks? So you can use some of these heuristics to guide yourself in picking resources. But obviously for practical skills where there isn't this under the iceberg mass of like kind of academic or scientific research propping it up, you know, when I was learning to do portrait drawing, it was a little hard to figure out like, well, what are the techniques? What are even the methods that are out there that exist? And like, what are the comparisons of them? But I think if you set that as a goal, you could do a survey. So you don't have to go really, really deep to figure out, okay, well, there's, you know, drawing with a grid, there's sight sizing, there's like a few different techniques that people like teach. And so then you can kind of be like, okay, I think I'm going to go with this one. And then you pick a book and you dig deeper. But you're absolutely right. And the sort of, as the Dunning-Kruger effect implies, that like when you're starting out, you're more likely to make mistakes in picking some of these resources. So you do have to be kind of flexible. You have to like pick a resource. Okay, this one, you jump around a little bit. That helps you, I think, balance out some of those weaknesses, so you don't just get stuck in like, well, you picked something, but it turns out it was a really bad place to start.
So don't stick with the first book, no matter what, but try out different things and see what works for you. So talking about learning a new skill, and maybe some of the listeners are like, oh, these two young whippersnappers, of course they can learn new skills, but I'm a little bit more seasoned. Like, an old dog doesn't learn any more new tricks. Is it true that adults have a harder time acquiring skills compared to kids?
Yeah, I mean, several years ago, I decided to do like a bit of a deep dive reading some of the research on this question. And the thing that struck me from the research, and I mean, again, I'm also like pulling this back out of hazy memories, so don't ask me for citations right now. But when I'm pulling it back from the memory, one of the things that struck me is that the kind of like average adult's perception of their cognitive decline is probably much less than it actually is. So the sort of curve of like fluid working memory intelligence is like it peaks in your 20s and then it declines, but it's like a fairly gradual decline. And then it's sort of more toward the end of life, where especially where you have conditions like dementia, Alzheimer's and stuff, that it can really like nosedive. But from like a pure, your mental horsepower point of view, it's not obvious that you shouldn't be able to perform, maybe you're like 10, 20% less efficient as you were when you were 21. I tend to think that part of the issue is that we go through this life cycle transition. So in our youth, learning is a major central part of our life. We're doing it all the time. And then you get into midlife where you're in your career, you're working, you're raising a family, and you're learning, but it's not like a priority, right? You're just doing your job, just doing the thing you already know how to do is the priority. And so if later, the kids grow up, you find yourself a little bit more free time, you want to learn French, you want to learn painting, you want to learn something else. It's been a while since you've been in that learning environment. And so I think it's just like someone in their 50s can get into shape if they want to. They're not going to be an elite athlete the way a 20-year-old will. But the problem is that if you've spent 20 years where you haven't been working out, it can be very daunting, or if it's been a long time since you've done that. So I tend to think it's more the life cycle, or kind of even the sociological thing, like going back to a college class if you're middle age is not only the feeling of like, oh, maybe I'm not as smart, but also like, oh, I'm sitting in the lecture hall with these kids, right? Or I'm, joining this community college class, and it's like, oh, but it's all these, people who are much younger than me. I think that is a far bigger factor than the sort of actual cognitive decline, which it exists. But I my feeling from reading that research was like, oh, this is actually much more minor than people kind of often hype it up to be.
I can also imagine, and I don't know if I read this in your book or this is my own genius coming up with this, that as an adult, I have skills that a kid doesn't have. So if you were to pitch me against a 4-year-old in learning, I don't know, Norwegian, then that 4-year-old has a lot of like plus points on its side, like inhibition to talk and all of that. But I could be like, look at me writing flashcards. That's something you can't do.
Yes.
And I can afford Duolingo and I have a smartphone and you don't. And an adult might be able to afford a video course that a 16-year-old at the same time might not be able to get into. So there's some plus points to being an salary earning adult as well.
Absolutely. Well, so there's a few ways you can take it. So one is that in knowledge intensive domains, again, going back to this kind of like central finding of educational psychology of the importance of background knowledge, that if you are learning in a field that is very knowledge heavy, and so it's loaded more on crystallized intelligence and less on fluid intelligence, then the peaks for success in those intellectual endeavors happen much later. So like historians peak late, physicists peak early. And that's just because for physicists, the body of knowledge is smaller, but it's kind of dense. Like it's like you have to go up this conceptual hierarchy that's higher and higher and higher. And you have to perform very difficult work to make a contribution. Whereas the historian is mostly like that they've read every book on that topic, and that just takes a long time to do. And so that's one thing. For certain types of subjects, it seems to benefit the person who has more wisdom than wit. And then there's also, I think, evidence that our cognitive abilities maturing and that actually giving us some advantages. So one of the findings that I like to trot out, and I wrote a post about this, and I actually got people who were sort of like, I don't know, maybe kind of arguing with me about it, but I felt like the evidence was very clearly on my side.
Well, that's what you get when you write a post on the internet. There are people arguing with you.
Because it was surprising. So the classic idea is that children learn languages better than adults. And we kind of know this because if you think of any immigrant family that comes and the parents come when they're in their mid-30s and the kids come when they're like 5, you talk to them 5 years later, the kids speak English or whatever the native language is perfectly without an accent, and the parents, they're like a little better than when they came, but they still have an accent, they still make grammatical mistakes. Like clearly there's something about language learning in early childhood or sort of prepubescence that is different than when you're learning as an adult. But people make the mistake of assuming that children learn languages faster than adults. Like they may reach a higher level of eventual attainment, but if you do these studies where you give them the same kind of input environment, where you're having the same kind of like language learning course, children don't actually learn the fastest. Like if you look at a few year period of time, or like 100 hours, 200 hours of this course, it's actually adolescents that learn the fastest. Adults are like a little bit close second. And it's presumably because when you're a child, you're not able to sit still, you're not able to pay attention, you're not able to do the flashcards and these kinds of things. Like your cognitive machinery hasn't fully developed. So even if you have an uncanny ear for picking up accents, so you can perfectly say it the way that a native person was, it takes you longer actually to learn as a kid than as an adult for most languages, which I think is not a commonly appreciated point.
I think we've destroyed a lot of excuses for our listeners now. We're like, dang, I wish I hadn't listened to that. Now I have no more excuse to learn X, Y, and Z.
Yeah.
Let's use your portrait sketching training. Let's say you're doing that for 10 years. You're enjoying it. It's a hobby. You're dabbling in it and you have some fun doing that. You've been doing it for 10 years. And now you're at a point where, I want to refresh that. I want to up my skill 50%, 100%.
Yeah.
Where would you start?
Yeah, I mean, I think the frontier of like a skill you've been doing for a long time and pushing it forward, that's often the hardest thing to do, right? Like most learning follows this kind of like diminishing returns curve. Like when you start learning a new language, the first 100 words you learn are super useful. You're going to you're going to hear them all the time. They're going to come up very frequently. When you've been speaking a language for 10 years, you learn 100 new words. Those words are going to maybe come up like once a year, right? So basically you get a lot less diminishing returns. And I think that's a generalization that applies to a lot of skills. So for a skill like portrait drawing, which I think is like a creative skill or a skill that has, it has also like a motor component. For me, for instance, like I've written 2 books I've written for decades now. And for me to be a better writer, it's really sort of like, well, better in what way, right? Because I could do something differently, but better is, going to be very subjective. And I think the same is true for portrait drawing. And so I tend to think that when you get to that kind of frontier, what you're trying to do is less monotonically improving along some sort of like linear dimension of proficiency and more trying to move your skill in a different direction. So, if I were a portrait artist in some way, that would be what I would be looking at doing. Like, what do I admire about other people's work that I would like to at least be able to do or move in that direction? And so I think this idea of deliberate practice is very important here, of like identifying some aspect of your performance, creating new constraints on the performance that will push you out of old habits, push you out of what comes automatically into sort of the new set of constraints. And are those new sets of constraints always better? No, but it gives you more versatility. And sometimes it unlocks things that you didn't know were there. So I think, for me, for writing, I'll use my own personal example because it's a little bit closer to home. I wrote a first book, Ultra Learning, which was much more personal. It opens with my personal stories. It was much more like, here's my opinion, here's what I think based on my personal experiences. And when I wrote this book, I wanted to try a different kind of writing. I wanted to try something that was more journalistic. I didn't want it to be just peppered with my personal opinions. I wanted, when I'm saying something, for me to like have a source or to have like, this is what I think is coming from the research. And that was a very different kind of style. And so that put different constraints about my writing that were not as familiar. It was not as automatic, but I think also forced me to get a lot better at doing research. It got me to do a lot better at fact checking stuff that I'm saying. And that, I think, forced me to learn some new abilities, those extra 100 words in the vocabulary that I think probably will make me better as a writer in the long run. And so I think when you're thinking about these mature skills that you've practiced for a long time, it's often that process of like identifying some sort of direction you want to have, implementing new constraints, and then working on that. And then you can reintegrate that into your overall skill set.
And because we were talking about portrait sketching, just as an example, while you were talking, I was reminded of me going through a drawing class in university, and a friend of mine also in that class, she had some experience in drawing already. Mm-hmm. And the teacher said to her, you will have to unlearn some of the stuff you already know.
Yeah.
And in your book, you also write that sometimes it's important to unlearn and then to relearn something new.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking of, I don't know if this was the example that you used in the book, but a couple of times you talked about like typing with 10 fingers or using like the 2 index fingers and switching from one to the other, which sounds incredibly difficult. Like we had in high school in Germany, we had a class where you learned to type with 10 fingers. And that was my absolute nemesis. Like this was the worst grades I ever got in school ever. I'm so happy I learned it because I am like super able to type with 10 fingers now. But I'm thinking like all my colleagues that I had when I was working in computer games or coding or the film industry, like most of them were typing with 2 fingers. And I'm thinking like when you're in a state like that, where you're kind of proficient with the way that you're doing something, and now it's time for reset and to relearn it better. How does the unlearning happen?
Yeah, unlearning is kind of funny because within the cognitive psychology literature, there's a real kind of controversy over whether it's actually even possible to unlearn anything. Like the memory is always kind of there, right? When you learn something, it's kind of there. So what you're doing when you unlearn is really learning a kind of competing framework, a competing set of skills. And so what makes it difficult is that if the old way of doing something is really ingrained, really well trained, then you have to build up the new way of doing it to a level of automaticity that it will override the old way of doing it. And that can be quite challenging. So that difficulty applies particularly strongly with like highly proceduralized skills. So proceduralization is this idea that like a lot of skills start out as kind of explicit instructions or explicit like memories in our head, but that over time they've, become something that's relatively automatic, relatively unthinking. So motor skills are like the classic example of that. Like when you swing a golf club, they're saying, okay, straighten your shoulders and bend your knees and, grip it like this and, remember the follow through, and you remember that when you're learning in the beginning. But then after you've been golfing for 10 years, you don't even think about it. You just do a swing. And even thinking about it can impair how you perform because you're like taking a proceduralized skill and you're kind of like interrupting it. So the only way you could improve a golf swing, and I mean, this is a fraught prospect as I talk about in the book, is to try to create a new motor pattern and practice it enough so that it will override the previous one, or adjust an existing motor program so that it can serve the same goal. And so I think, the idea here of unlearning, I think, is that we always have to do this to some degree. So we always have to be identifying, okay, this is the thing that comes automatically and I have to like inhibit that. I have to work on it. And so the deliberate practice is the way to do it. But we have to be delicate when we're doing it too, because when you have a way of doing something that's tried and tested, and then you try something new, the new way is often going to be worse for a while. So this was the real sort of like message that I wanted to kind of give in this chapter, is this improvement not being a straight line. That like, if you want to go from hunting and pecking to typing on the home rows, you have to accept that there's going to be a period of time where you're going to type worse because it's slower, you're going to make more mistakes, it's going to be unfamiliar than what you were doing before. And that's the investment that you have to make in order to come through on the other end with a touch typing ability. Now, I don't think everyone has to do this for all skills, but it is certainly, if you're trying to continuing up the scale of mastery, I think it's something that becomes inevitable.
How do we make that transition then? So in the book, I think the example you used was Tiger Woods changing his swing style. And
quite controversially, I might add, yeah.
and I don't understand anything about golf except that I like these little carts they race around with.
Yeah.
But apparently he changed the style. Yeah. And then in the next season, he used the new style to his sort of like detriment because it wasn't honed in perfectly yet. And I'm thinking of someone, let's use a coder, a programmer who's typing with 2 fingers, switching to a 10-finger system. Now, probably not on day one, because that means like nothing gets done at work for like a month, which is probably not a good career move. How long do I sit at work typing with 2 fingers, learning 10 fingers at home to then say, okay, next Tuesday, I'm going to go to work and I'm make the hard switch?
Yeah, I don't know whether there's like a good rule of thumb for doing this. I mean, I don't know the typing example well enough. So like, it would be really interesting if there was some research where someone was like taking people who hunt and peck and being like, how long does it take teaching them proper typing skills before that can effectively replace the old skill? That would be a really interesting experiment if someone could run it.
Okay, the experiment shall be conducted.
Yes. Okay, I have sent out the request. Psychologists, get ready. No, I'm just joking. But it would be very interesting to know if there's actually like, is it a week? Is it a month? Like, I don't know. But I can think of this in many circumstances where, like, when you're embarking, like the more general point, I guess you could say, is that when you're embarking on any kind of learning project, you're always dealing with a little bit of that dilemma that, okay, I can go with the thing that I know, or I can go with the new thing that I'm going to be bad at. So it's going to have like a short-term cost. And the question is just sort of like, do I make that switch? So I can even think about this project that I did with a friend. We did this language learning project where we traveled to different countries, learning different languages. And the idea was that when we would land in the country, we would just speak the language of that country as a way of like practicing it. So when we went to Spain, for instance, we would just speak in Spanish. And it's a bit of a daunting prospect, especially since we didn't have, like, I think for Spanish, we maybe did like, 2 months of Pimsleur. I think that was about all we had for Spanish. So certainly not like we'd had like, 18 years of practice. But there is this kind of paradox, because if you go to Spain, let's say, and you just speak in English, you can quickly make English-speaking friends, either Spanish locals who speak English or other expats, and those become your friends. And then that reinforces this decision to speak English that it becomes very hard to break out of afterward. So if you go and then you just say, you know what, screw it, I'm going to just speak in Spanish, and you just do that, it is harder in the beginning. You do suffer from like, the lack of articulateness, this kind of thing. But because you're getting all this practice, you quickly get back on that sort of higher level of fluency, at least, if not proficiency, that allows you to get through your day-to-day life. And that, I think, puts you on a different trajectory. So for the coder, I think that's a really interesting dilemma. My feeling is that if you could at all do it, I would do it as soon as possible, the transition, because you spend most of your day typing, right? And so if you're still hunting and pecking at the job, you have to do a lot of night classes of typing before that typing has reached the 100, 200 hours where it feels perfectly comfortable. Whereas if you switch to the job, maybe that's a week or two. But if you're doing it on the side, maybe you're doing it for 3 to 8 months. So my feeling is that for a lot of these kind of skills, you often do want the Band-Aid approach. You do often want to just rip it right off, because if you're sort of juggling both, then the amount of additional practice time outside of your everyday activity where you have to do it this other way is really hard. And you're still reinforcing the bad habit when you're in work and this kind of thing. So that would be my intuition. But I mean, it would be very interesting to see if there's any experimental evidence about like how much practice you should have before you put it into practice in the job.
Well, we put the call out, so it's just a matter of time before the results pour in. Excellent.
Sure.
So, because we were talking about programming, here's a little bit of a curveball. Thinking about the artificial intelligence or better large language models. Something that I am doing is a year or two ago, I used to really pride myself in automating scripts like in Google Sheets, and have like my little scripts in there that color coded and did the math automatically. And I'd spent like 3 hours getting something together that would then save me like half an hour. But it was brilliant. Like, this was really good stuff. Yeah. Now something like ChatGPT does that for me, which is brilliant. I'm not complaining, but I'm wondering, for someone who would say want to learn a programming language, to use that or substitute that with any other skill. He wants to learn a programming language. Now there are two options. I can take the easy way and get like all the little things that I need from a large language model, and then I'll be good. Or I can just disconnect that and spend half a year learning the language, which is going to be quite costly in terms of time and brain damage. And you say there's a line where someone like Michael could say, okay, you know what? It's time to actually hunker down, get a couple of books and learn this from the ground up.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, despite doing this MIT project that we alluded to in the beginning of the show, and like I've done a fair bit of programming in my life, but not so much professionally. I hadn't done that much programming since ChatGPT came out. And then I decided to do this little kind of script. And I was like, well, everyone I know who's a programmer is like raving about how good ChatGPT is for programming. So let's try it out. And working with ChatGPT programming was like a totally different experience than I'd ever had programming before, because my experience with programming is that unless you're doing something that's very familiar, most of what you're doing is like trying to get it to work. You're like, you get it working, you're like, oh, why is this not working? And like, oh, I forgot this, or like, especially if you're doing something unfamiliar, like that's most of it. And so it was surreal to be able to be like, you copy or paste, you put it into ChatGPT and be like, why is this not working? And they're like, oh, well, you forgot to do this. And you're like, oh, thank you, ChatGPT. So the question is like, is that ability to have access to that, is that a help or a hindrance in learning? And I could definitely see the case where it would be a hindrance. Because if you're just getting started and you have the ability to ask the machine to make code that does whatever you want to do, and you don't have the ability to understand what the machine is outputting, then you're not going to learn anything, right? It's a little bit like if you use Google Translate for all of your, communication with a colleague, you're never going to learn the language. But a lot of, I would say, traditional programming learning, the experience that that me and all the other old timers went through, is riddled with frustration, where you spend an hour trying to figure out what is going wrong with your code. So I don't know enough to know where the dividing line would be, but I would suspect that the right kind of thing is probably some sort of hybrid. So you need to know the basics. You need to know enough of the sort of like fundamentals of programming. Like you need to work through the hello world exercise and like this is a for loop and this kind of stuff. Because when ChatGPT spits it out, you're not going to understand it.
Learn anything.
But I think the ability to dialogue with the machine to be like, explain what this code is doing, and then it can explain what the code is doing is huge, because I feel like it can really like compress a lot of that trial and error frustration. So I think there can be a lot of aid to it. But again, I think, again, it's one of those things that like it's a tool, but it's almost too good. So it can just do the whole job for you. And so you might not learn it. Now, whether or not you need to learn it, I don't know. That's a hard call to make, because I feel like in our lives in general, we depend on, for the most part, other people, but increasingly also machine systems to do things that we don't know how to do. And so how much do you need to learn things? I don't know. I think it really depends on what your end goal is. If you want to be a competent programmer, you certainly can't rely on ChatGPT to write all your code for you.
So as you were talking, I was thinking of other ways in which I probably used it more. No, there were a couple of things I could think of where I didn't use it so well. And that is when it came to writing. Because like something like writing an assertive complaint email to a company, like that's raising my anxiety levels through the roof. So I'm like, hey, ChatGPT, write this letter for me. What I could have done instead is write it on my own and then be like, hey, what do you think about this? Make a couple of changes, because then I'm practicing the root skills and getting out of my comfort zone and writing all of those nasty words. And then ChatGPT comes in and makes it, Michael, don't call them that.
Yeah.
Rephrase this. And I'm like, that's really good. Or same thing for like writing a website or writing copy for a product. Like start out on your own and then get feedback from the machine to improve and learn that way.
Yeah. I mean, I think that can be a great tool. Like it's kind of related to what I was saying with programming, or like, why is this not working? Or like, how would you improve this? And then it has good suggestions. I don't know. For me, I feel like, and I think this is, I don't think I'm alone in thinking this, that ChatGPT tends to be more useful at the peripheral of your skill set than in the center core. So I don't use ChatGPT for writing at all. Like I don't like how ChatGPT writes. I think it writes in this kind of, I think almost by design, this fairly bland kind of like everyone recognizes ChatGPT's writing voice. It's just kind of like this sort of insipid, neutral helper bot. Like even Wikipedia articles, I think, are often written with a little bit more grace. I don't really see it replacing me anytime soon, but it's very useful for things where, like, for instance, if I have to embark on a research project and it's in a domain that I don't understand very well, I will ask ChatGPT for recommendations, and I'll say, like, summarize the arguments from these books and like recommend other things. So it's sort of like the further you go away from your core competency, the more the fact that it's this universal generalist is quite helpful, I think. And so I think there's lots of interesting kind of hybrid ways you can make that work, where, recently I had to come up with this book list or reading list on a lot of topics where I've, some of them I've read some books, but I didn't have like all the books on the thing read. And ChatGPT was able to I was like, I've read this book. I'm looking for stuff that's like this. And it was just like 8 books and like summarize them for me. And so I could pick like, well, maybe this one or this one. And then, that's a very useful function to have. And so I think, using it as an auxiliary tool is there. But I think, the technology is still so new. I don't really have there's a wild west. There's no strong guidelines of like the right way to use ChatGPT.
So let's take a turn here and look at the teaching side of things. And this is
sure.
ironic because how would parents be able to bring those skills to their kids and make them like better learners? And I use the word ironic because a lot of the kids will be much more sophisticated in using ChatGPT that their parents are. But I'm talking what if you're a parent and you're dealing with a 5-year-old, a 6-year-old, they're just coming into school. What are some skills that they could give their kids, and how would they do it?
Well, I mean, this is maybe a more narrow answer to the question than you were thinking of, but I mean, reading all the research on reading education, it's like super clear that you want your kids to have a good grounding in like a kind of phonics-based approach for learning to read. That I have a child who's 4.5, for instance, and like that has really influenced how I'm thinking about his education. And I mean, I do think there's a bit of a tide change in that, like schools are now starting to make phonics and this kind of more systematic approach to teaching reading is becoming more common. But I still think in the general kind of early years education, direct instruction as a tool is sort of like not that well used. So, I mean, the very first step I would be doing is that if I had a kid and they were struggling, like they were falling behind or they were not really achieving to their potential, I would definitely lean on some of those systems. I would look at like, okay, how can I employ either in my spare time or find a tutor, or, you know, even just in the school selection, if there's some school choice for what you're going to be teaching kids with, to use some of these tools for learning, because I feel like there's an enormous amount of research that kind of favors this more strongly guided approach, particularly in the early years of education. And it's been kind of a little bit on the outs in terms of educational fads. Like a lot of teachers who were trained in kind of the old method kind of poo-poo this sort of approach. Like all the sort of professional development seminars really kind of say, oh yeah, you know, that doesn't work, but the research is fairly strongly in favor of that. So that would be like my kind of narrow answer to that question is, you know, the extent to which you can give them a strong grounding in the kind of fundamental building blocks and, you know, give them a lot of practice with those basic skills. And it takes a lot of practice. We sort of underestimate how much practice it takes to learn to read because we do it so effortlessly. But if you can give that grounding, I think that you give your kids a good chance. But in terms of the long term or the bigger picture, I think as they get older, I think you want to be giving them more opportunities for self-direction, more opportunities to explore their interests, encourage them to pursue their interests. You know, if you have the ability to like funnel them into something that they think they're interested in, I think that's valuable, because eventually you want to have adults that are not just capable of following a lesson plan given by the teacher, but can set their own goals for learning and do that kind of stuff as well.
So let's wrap up with the last chapter where you talk about stepping outside of your comfort zone in order to learn new skills. You need to expose yourself. You need to do some exposure work to get over that fear response and in using the new skills.
Yeah, I mean, it had such a big impact in how I think about my learning that it's like, well, I have to include this as a chapter. And the basic sort of takeaway from exposure therapy from like years of training is that for people who have heightened anxiety or fears about a particular situation, getting them to experience those fears, getting them to experience those anxieties has on net the effect of reducing those fears and anxieties. And so I think the idea that we need to face our fears and have courage in this kind of stuff is common wisdom throughout the ages. But again, sometimes there's this sort of, I think, instinct, especially among people who are in a position where we are offering people advice or we are trying to console them through difficult times, to try to shelter and protect them from that. And the research shows pretty clearly that often makes things worse. I thought was surprising and not as widely appreciated. But then there's all these little details about getting it right that I thought were really fascinating. So there's no such thing as unlearning, you know, in the neurological sense viewpoint, the idea that you don't unlearn your fears, you just learn safety that suppresses the fear, and that the safety is somewhat more brittle and narrower than the fear learning. So you have all these situations where you can have a successful session of exposure therapy, reduce someone's phobia, their social anxiety, their general anxiety, but then either, you know, there's a long period of time and then the fear returns, or they have some totally unrelated life stressor and then their phobia is back. Like these things can happen. And I mean, it's disappointing that they happen, but I think if we know that that's sort of how they work, you can kind of design your own plans for doing it. And I've experienced the benefits of this myself. So I sort of mentioned this project about practicing the language learning, and certainly going to a country where you barely know the language and then sort of stumbling through speaking it on a nonstop basis is an exercise in exposure therapy. But the thing that's kind of crazy about it is that, well, like everyone understands that would be somewhat anxiety inducing or stressful when you're in the moment. But the thing that's really difficult to communicate to people is that if you do it for 2 weeks, it will feel totally normal. Yeah. That's the thing that is hard to persuade people. So I think the takeaway I took from the exposure therapy research is that you don't have to like explain to people that, oh yeah, you should face your fears. We maybe can intellectually understand it, but we never understand it in our gut. Is that, yeah, but if you do it for this, like in this concentrated period of time, it will feel normal. It will not be scary, which is the real crazy thing about it, that like, yeah, if you actually just stick to it for a couple of weeks, it's going to be totally fine. You're going to it's going to feel like nothing. I think that's the biggest cognitive illusion that we have to try to overcome in our thinking about ourselves.
There's a lot of similarities in me teaching or working with people and teaching them conversation skills, because the first thing they want to know is like, what do I say? What do I say next? How do I respond to this? Give me this like 1,000 page manual that is like a flow chart to any conversation. And then I'll learn that by heart, and then I'll be good. And then I'll go out and I'll talk to the very first person. I'm like, no, we're going to turn this around. I'm not going to teach you any conversation skills at all. I'll throw you into some fun exercises out there where I just want you to go to strangers and tell them a joke or ask for help. And then learn that having this interaction, even without any skills built in, besides basic like knowledge of the language, of course, that, oh, this was actually nice. Like they were responding kindly. They were laughing with me. They were reacting. I had some fun. This was good. And now that fear response that would get in the way of having a good conversation in the first place, now that we got that out of the way because they've done it 5 times, 10 times. And usually like 5 times is oftentimes enough for them. No, let's dive in. Like, this is fun. Let me give me some more stuff. And now we can start working on the skills because that immediate fear response is no longer activated.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of crazy how these kind of unconscious mechanisms in our brain, like I really like Joseph Ledoux's book, Anxious, where he talks about how they've really mapped out a lot of the circuitry of the amygdala and these sort of limbic regions that control threat detection. And these are, in Ledoux's belief, these are totally unconscious. These are not, the activity of this circuit is below human awareness. But it bubbles up in our working memory, the part of our brain that is conscious. And it's very interesting to me how our sort of rational thoughts, our conscious thoughts, our explicit beliefs, how they're so shaped by this sort of underlying circuitry. And so, I remember I was doing a podcast where someone was talking about this experience of like the language learning thing. And they were just trying to be helpful in like suggesting things. They're like, oh yeah, when like you start doing it and like people laugh at you and this kind of thing. And they were just saying it like kind of like, yeah, that happens and you get over it. And I was like, but they don't do that. Like that's the thing. They don't do that. If you just tell people, oh, I'm trying to learn this language, I'm practicing it for the next time, do you mind speaking to me? People are actually excited about that they're happy. Like that's the problem, is that you have this fear. And so all these beliefs and explicit imaginings and things that they're all downstream of that, right? So you come up with these scenarios that they're the only things that come to mind because you have this fear. But if I was saying, oh, you're going to go to an open mic club and like do a stand-up comedy set, and then your feeling is like, oh yeah, well, I'm going to be booed and like people are going to like hate me and I'm going to just like freeze on stage. And I don't know what would happen. So again, this is the whole idea of doing these behavioral experiments and why that's so important for the therapeutic benefit. But I think there's just as likely a chance that you go up there and people actually do think you're funny. And it's great. And you just get this rush from it. Like, I mean, people who are professional stand-up comedians, that's what happened to them. They went up on a stage, they told some jokes, the jokes were funny, people laughed and they felt great. So I think this is sort of where we get in trouble, is that like our fears and our like, anxieties about things, it's not even a question of like, well, is that impossible that happened or it's a false belief, but it's just, we focus on these negative outcomes. We focus on these things because this unconscious threat circuitry, that's what it allows us to focus on. And so you really do have to kind of leap into the unknown and then realize, oh yeah, actually, when you're learning another language and you kind of say like, hey, I'm practicing this language, do you mind if I speak to you? People are like, yeah, that sounds cool. More people should be doing that. Like it's a weird experience, but yeah, that's my experience of it.
Yeah, that's it. It's that leap into the unknown and actually doing it that gives you that result, because the other option is to lean back and to say, no, I'm waiting for the day where I feel confident in doing that. Just going to sit at home and wait until I feel confident, and then it's going to be easy. That's kind of true, but it's just never going to happen. You have to start with the behavior first for the emotions to follow behind. You have to act in that confident manner, or get up on the stage or talk to people, whatever it is, in order for you to feel confident about it. It doesn't work the other way around.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, Scott, thank you so much for your time and your wisdom and your book. Where can our listeners find out more about you?
Sure. Well, they can check out my website at scotthyoung.com. I've got tons of articles on, learning, psychology, some of these topics that may be of interest to the people listening here. And then they can check out my books, Get Better at Anything, which we've been discussing today, and also my previous book, Ultra Learning. They're available Amazon, Audible, wherever you get your books from.
Thank you so much, Scott. This was a real pleasure.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was great chatting.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock. If you enjoy our podcast, you can help us out by leaving a review or contributing on Patreon.
You can get more psychology tips by subscribing to our newsletter and connecting with us on social media.
We'd like to thank our podcast production manager, Jadine Stout-Williams.
This podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only and is not meant to be a substitute for mental health treatment. If you're looking for mental health treatment, please visit the resources page of our website, offtheclockpsych.com.